On a cold weekend in West Allis, Wisconsin, an ordinary parking lot became the kind of place you do not forget. Bright signage, late-night streetlights, cars rolling by like nothing in the world could ever go wrong. And yet, something had already gone wrong. Police say a 4-year-old boy, Dante Campbell, was found unresponsive after his mother called 911 and pulled into a Dairy Queen parking lot. The public details are simple, almost too simple for how heavy they are. A child, a call for help, a place that should have been harmless. In the first hours, people always look for the version of a story that lets them breathe. An accident, a sudden illness, anything that does not force you to picture a small child suffering where nobody can see. But investigators would later describe the allegations as horrific, not complicated, not mysterious, just horrific. The courtroom reaction, reported by local outlets, tells you what kind of file this became almost instantly. A county court commissioner struggled to stay composed as the allegations were read, calling it potentially the worst case he had ever seen. Those are not words officials use lightly, especially people who have seen everything. Prosecutors charged Dante's father, Davario Cruz, age 21, with multiple felonies including first-degree reckless homicide and repeated acts of physical abuse causing death. His mother, Charlotte Kurek, age 31, was charged with chronic child neglect, including an allegation where the consequence was death. The words on the page matter because they outline how the state is choosing to describe this. Not a single moment, but a pattern. Not just violence, but neglect. Not only a child who suffered, but a household where warnings were allegedly present and ignored. Police and court documents, as reported, also describe concerns involving Dante's twin sister. That detail hits like a second impact. It means the story is not only about what happened to one child, but what may have been happening in the same home to another child at the same time. When cases like this break, the community tries to build a timeline from scraps. The last normal photo, the last holiday, the last time someone saw the child in public and thought, he looks tired, or he looks quiet, but said nothing because nobody wants to be wrong. And then the questions start, the ones people whisper first. How does a child get to that point without someone stepping in? How much of childhood can disappear inside an apartment, behind a closed door, in a routine that looks normal from the outside? And what does it take for the truth to finally spill out into a place as public as a fast food parking lot? To understand what happened, we have to do what these stories always demand. We have to rewind. We have to walk back through the days and the alleged pattern that led to that moment when a mother called 911, pulled into a Dairy Queen, and a child's life was already slipping away. The hardest part about chronic neglect is that it rarely looks like a single dramatic event. It looks like erosion. Missed meals that become regular. Missed appointments that become years. Bruises that become background. A child who learns to be quiet because noise brings consequences. In a dramatized reconstruction like this, you do not need to invent monsters. You simply follow the logic of the charges. The state alleges repeated acts of physical abuse. The state alleges chronic neglect. Those two concepts together describe a home where danger was not a surprise. It was a climate. Imagine the small, everyday moments that can turn into a trap. A child spills something and flinches before anyone even speaks. A child asks for food and learns that asking can be treated like misbehavior. A child falls asleep alert, the way kids do when they have learned that deep sleep is not safe. People often ask why neighbors do not report. But the more honest question is why so many reports, when they happen, do not turn into meaningful intervention. And the answer is messy. Sometimes fear, sometimes confusion, sometimes systems that treat each call like an isolated event instead of part of a pattern. In this case, public reporting includes a family member describing attempts to contact authorities because of concerns about abuse. Even without knowing every private detail, that single element tells you something important. This did not feel invisible to everyone. Now step into the mindset of a child. Dante was 4. 4 is not old enough to understand adults as complicated people. 4 is old enough to understand pain. 4 is old enough to understand hunger. 4 is old enough to understand that the people you depend on can also be the people you fear. And when you have a twin, the confusion can be even sharper. 2 children in the same space. 2 lives developing side by side. If one child is hurt, the other child learns too. Learns what sounds mean danger. Learns what footsteps mean. Learns what mood means. Reports say the court heard allegations relating to neglect and abuse toward the twin sister as well. That means this story, at least as alleged, is not only about one child suffering, it is about a household where risk may have been shared. Then there is the public moment, the one everyone can picture. A car pulling into a parking lot, a frantic call, first responders arriving to a scene that is instantly wrong. Local reporting described Dante as unresponsive and covered in bruises. That detail is clinical, but it is also the kind of detail that changes the air in a room when people hear it. Because bruises are not a mystery, bruises are evidence of impact. Evidence of a body being treated as something that can be struck. The commissioner's reaction, described by multiple outlets, becomes more understandable when you connect it to what he was reading. A seasoned court official hearing allegations about a small child and struggling to keep his voice steady. And behind all of this, investigators are doing what they always do in these cases. They are building the timeline. They are comparing statements to injuries. They are looking for the gap between what someone says happened and what a child's body says happened. By the time charges are filed, the state is not guessing. The state is drawing a line from alleged behavior to a death, and then naming what it believes that line represents. In the next part, we move from atmosphere to alleged mechanics. What prosecutors say happened in the window before the 911 call, and why the state is treating this as far more than a tragedy. Court filings and reporting describe a case where prosecutors say the father beat the child, and that the mother allowed it to happen. Those two ideas, side by side, explain the structure of many child homicide cases. One person is accused of doing, the other is accused of failing to stop. The reason that matters is because it destroys a comforting myth. People want to believe abuse requires secrecy, and that secrecy requires isolation from everyone. Sometimes that is true, but often, the real secret is not the violence. The secret is the way it becomes normalized inside a household, repeated until it feels routine to the adults and inevitable to the child. Prosecutors charged DeVario Cruz with first-degree reckless homicide and repeated acts of physical abuse causing death, along with other charges. That phrase, repeated acts, is doing a lot of work. It implies a pattern, not a single strike. A pattern changes everything. A pattern suggests there were earlier moments when something could have changed. An argument, a call, a visit, a neighbor finally insisting on a welfare check, a relative showing up anyway, a teacher asking why a child has not been seen. A pattern suggests the violence, if proven, had time to become predictable. Then there is the public detail that anchors the final day, the Dairy Queen parking lot. According to reporting, the mother called 911 from there. In the starkest version of the story, the call was not made from a home, not from a clinic, not from a place that signals safety. It was made from a place that signals urgency and improvisation, like the situation had reached a point where it could no longer be kept inside. In dramatized reconstruction, you can imagine the seconds before that call connects, hands shaking on a steering wheel, a child in the back seat too quiet, the unbearable calculation adults make when consequences finally feel real. But we do not need to invent a confession to feel the weight of the charges, because the charges already tell you what the state believes the truth is. They also tell you what the state believes about the mother's role. Charlotte Kurek was charged with chronic child neglect, including an allegation where the consequence was death. Chronic implies duration. It implies ongoing failure to provide basic care or protection. It implies a child living in conditions that did not happen once, but happened long enough to become a lifestyle. And the public reporting about the hearing adds one more detail that feels like a gut punch. The commissioner needed a break after addressing the allegations. Think about that. People who work in the criminal system do not get to be fragile. They are trained to keep their voices even, their faces neutral, their words controlled. When someone in that position says they are having difficulty being composed, it is a signal flare. It says, whatever is in these documents is not ordinary, even for this room. So what happens next? Legally, there will be hearings, motions, arguments about evidence, about statements, about timelines. The defense will push back. The state will push forward. This case will grind through the process that always feels too slow to people who want immediate justice. But emotionally, the story moves faster than the courts ever can. Because the community reaction starts right away. People talk about their own kids, their own neighbors, the bruises they once dismissed, the tantrum they heard through a wall and ignored, the child they saw in a grocery store who looked too thin, and they told themselves it was none of their business. And that is why these cases spread. Not because people love tragedy, but because people are terrified of the idea that they could be standing next to it in line at a pharmacy and never recognize it. In the final part, we talk about what this case reveals about responsibility and what viewers can realistically do with the discomfort it leaves behind without turning it into empty outrage. There is a temptation, when a case like this becomes public, to treat it like a horror story with a clear ending. Arrest, charges, court, sentencing, closure. But child abuse cases do not close cleanly, because the real damage is not limited to the day a child dies. The damage spreads outward, into surviving siblings, into extended family, into first responders, into jurors who will someday have to look at images they will never forget. Public reporting indicates that Dante's twin sister was also part of the case allegations. If you want one detail that captures why this story does not end with a jail door closing, it is that. Because for a surviving child, the aftermath is not a headline, it is a lifetime. Then there is the problem of recognition. People ask, how does this happen? Sometimes the answer is a total absence of outside contact. Sometimes it is isolation. But sometimes it is something worse. A community seeing pieces of a pattern and never assembling them. A bruise explained away. A missed preschool registration. A child who stops showing up anywhere. A caretaker who always has a reason. And when someone does try to assemble it, they may not be believed, or they may not know what to say, or they may be afraid of retaliation, or they may fear being labeled dramatic. In this case, a family member publicly described attempts to reach out for help. That matters because it points to a reality viewers need to hear. People do try, and when people try, systems need to be ready to take that seriously. This is where a story like Dante's becomes bigger than a single household. Not bigger in a way that excuses anyone. Not bigger in a way that turns a child into a symbol. Bigger in the sense that it forces the audience to confront two truths at once. First truth, if the allegations are proven, the responsibility for violence sits with the adults accused of it. Second truth, prevention is a community skill, not a private hope. So what do you do with that? If you are a viewer, you do not need to become a detective. You do not need to become an expert in bruising patterns. You do not need to gamble with a child's life because you are worried about being wrong. You need to do something simpler and harder. Refuse to normalize what your instincts are flagging. If you hear a child in prolonged distress next door and it does not sound like a normal tantrum, call. If you repeatedly see a child with unexplained injuries and the story never makes sense, report. If you know a child is being isolated from school and medical care, ask questions and contact professionals. And yes, people will say, I do not want to get involved. But getting involved is sometimes the only thing standing between a pattern and a funeral. This case is now in the legal system. The charges are filed, the process is moving, and in court the state will try to prove what it believes happened to Dante Campbell, a 4-year-old child whose last public location was a Dairy Queen parking lot in West Allis, Wisconsin. When that process ends, there will be a verdict and a sentence. But the larger question will still be waiting, quiet and uncomfortable. How many children are living in the early chapters of a story like this right now? And how many times will adults around them choose silence because silence feels safer than being wrong? If you remember anything after this video, remember that prevention rarely looks heroic. It looks awkward. It looks inconvenient. It looks like a phone call you were afraid to make. And sometimes, that call is the difference. Dante Campbell, 4 years old, a name that should never have become a case file. If this story leaves you angry, aim that anger somewhere useful. Learn the signs, trust patterns, not excuses. And when you feel your instincts warning you, do not wait for proof that arrives too late, because a child does not get a second chance at being saved.